Hi, I'm Rob and welcome back to the Uncut Network. On this podcast we rotate back and forth between directors, actors and super specific genres. We cover everything from the Irish horror scene to Rachel Sennott, never sure how to pronounce that, and Alejandro Jodorowsky, touching on everything from exploitation to names more people should know about and things your family won't endlessly question you for liking, plus everything in between. To cover all of this and more, I have been joined by Ygraine. Hello there.
Hi Rob, how are you?
Exhausted, but I think that's par for the course, really, isn't it?
Yeah, sure, look. End of the year, it's coming to the end of the year.
Yes. I've also been joined by James.
Hi Rob, glad to be back.
And Vincent.
What is a podcast? A collection of words assembled so some people sound clever? A contribution of wisdom to wider knowledge? A conversion of understanding into a digital hive mind? Like a shared memory? Like an idea spreading through consciousnesses? I'm Vincent and I say weird things.
Yeah, I've no idea what that's a reference to, so I'll just sort of move on. What is it a reference to?
What is a ghost?
Ah, okay.
Devil's Backbone.
Yeah. So yes, that is the hint. We'll be doing Guillermo Del Toro. This is a two-parter, and in this half we'll be doing The Devil's Backbone, Pan's Labyrinth and Pinocchio. But before we get in any of those movies, Ygraine, when was the first time you were aware, or... Well, yes, just keep it as that, when you were aware of Guillermo Del Toro, GDT?
The boyfriend who I was with back in college, he got me a box set that contained Pan's Labyrinth, Devil's Backbone and Kronos. And that was when I was first introduced, and I was just absolutely blown away by Pan's Labyrinth, which I'm sure everybody was the first time they saw it. And and then I just, obviously, it came to like Blade and Hellboy, and I was just absolutely taken by his visual, autoristic kind of technique, and he just like sings to my kind of gothic fairy tale.
Entertainer or Guillermo the goth weirdo? You never really do know, do you?
I'm praying it's the goth weirdo.
Hey, he can be an entertaining goth weirdo. The two are not mutually exclusive.
Well, I'm not going to get in a... Tim Burton says otherwise, but you know. Yeah. James, yourself, intro to GDT.
Well, I remember my first introduction to him was back in 2004. I was starting secondary school. I had this new friend who is, one of my oldest friends now, and he was endlessly talking about this great film he saw called Hellboy. And I remember just getting the DVD on his recommendation and then just being like, wow, this is really cool. And that was a cool start, but what really followed it on to holding my attention was a couple years later, in Spanish class, the teacher put on Pan's Labyrinth for her year 9 students to watch, and it's just something to not only be enraptured while you're watching it in Spanish class, but to have a whole classroom just be silent as the whole Pale Man sequence goes on. And it was just a very fun experience, and I never looked back now.
You had a very cool Spanish teacher. I did French at secondary school. Nothing like that from my French teacher. The closest I got was my history teacher scarring me for life, showing a 13-year-old threads. So no horror scares me now because of that.
I remember a French teacher I had at high school showed us Au revoir les enfants, which is kind of a Holocaust drama, so, you know, it's its own kind of trauma.
Yes, and Vincent, yourself.
Well,
when did you become aware of GDT?
Yeah. The first time I encountered GDT would have been when my mum and I watched Mimic on VHS. Must have been 98 or 99, but I I wasn't sufficiently sin-illiterate to know the name of the director. Then again, after Kronos and Mimic, he was hardly a household name. I think it must have been Blade 2, because I saw Blade 2 when it was out in the cinema in 2002, and then when Hellboy came along the year after, it was saying from the director of Blade 2. So I think that would have been when I first became aware of him, because when Pan's Labyrinth came along, I was like, yes, that guy who did that. So, I guess I was there, not quite at the beginning, but I became aware of him fairly early on.
Yeah. Well, he has a interesting history, doesn't he? Because Mimic was allegedly his big Hollywood breakthrough, but it was a horrible experience for him. To the point where he almost quit filmmaking. And I saw a little interview piece of him recently where he said Devil's Backbone was actually his second debut. It was he was saved by Pedro Almodovar, and that was his second debut. Which I think's doing Kronos a little bit dirty. It deserves a bit better than that. But, yes. Anybody else seen Kronos?
Yeah.
I'm assuming we all have.
Kronos is great.
I think I've seen everything that he's directed. I imagine others here have as well.
With the exception of Nightmare Alley.
Yeah. I really liked Nightmare Alley.
Preferred the original. Not that I can say that because I'm not seeing the remake, but the original's enough for me.
Fair.
Okay, so the three movies, as I said, are Devil's Backbone, Pan's Labyrinth, and Pinocchio. So we'll start with that second debut, as he put it. Devil's Backbone. So, Ygraine, what is The Devil's Backbone?
It is a 2001 kind of gothic horror in which a little boy is kind of tricked into going into an orphanage in 1939, where previously this shell has fallen and is now kind of undetonated and is almost like this monument in the middle of the the plaza within the orphanage. And he begins to experience some strange phenomena that centers around a missing boy called Santi. And going on is also this caretaker who is in search of supposed gold that is in the orphanage. And it's kind of these lives that center around the Spanish Civil War, as well as these little boys that are kind of just trying to survive anyway.
Yes, Gothic fairy tale. Very beautiful, but James, what are your feelings on The Devil's Backbone?
Well, in terms of Del Toro's work, I think it's a strong showing. I think I really like the way it uses the ghostly apparition to tell about trauma unresolved, and the way it can, holding on to such painful memories, can influence how people act for better or for worse. And I think it's a marvellous work from an outstanding director.
I mean, it's an interesting to look at it that way, isn't it? Because the whole idea now has become kind of endemic, really. It's a haunted house movie, it's a monster movie, it's a whatever movie where the thing represents trauma, and this is kind of a far bearer to that entire wave of things coming, really, because it's that, but also it's a little bit more emotionally nuanced, I think.
No,
Would you say that's
absolutely.
fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the use of trauma in horror films has kind of been a bit, in ways, laughable, thanks to the Halloween trilogy that recently happened, I think, for better or worse. But I think this is a really good way to approach it.
Well, if I could follow up on something there,
I
that was said in terms of this trauma aspect, absolutely. But I think it's important to note that it is the trauma of individuals, but also it's a trauma of a country. Ygraine mentioned that this is, of course, set in 1939, the final year of the Spanish Civil War, which we'll talk about in addition in relation to Pan's Labyrinth. And we're looking here at this microcosm of the country, the national trauma, the Spanish Civil War, and the subsequent regime of Francisco Franco inflicted upon Spain a cultural trauma that I suspect it is still dealing with, and films like this are about depicting that, the trauma that we see the boys go through, and in this orphanage in The Devil's Backbone, I think is very much an expression of that national trauma in something that is haunting and melancholy, brutal, yet beautifully tender, which I think is a key aspect. What might be one way you could sum up Del Toro's work. It's brutal yet tender.
Yeah, I mean, we've got this kind of metaphor of the orphanage being, when we talk about Gothic, we think about castles and manor houses and, whereas I feel like Del Toro does this really well. Well, yes, we have, a fixed abode, as it were. We've got this house for children, but really the Gothic haunted house within this is the whole country of Spain and how it's been divided. There's a really horrible part where the doctor, the kind of the headmaster of the school, goes and he witnesses an execution, and just how easily that these countrymen can kill each other just so horribly like that. And he comes off it, he's haunted by it. And each character has their own trauma and their own haunting. And even though we do have this very corporeal in a supernatural sense ghost, what each character is more haunted by is not only the past but the present as well. I just think, it's such, you can say it's a haunted house film, but it's very much a haunted country film. And I just love the way that he kind of embodies that and imbues that in the film.
What are some particular ways you think, Ygraine, that this is embodied? Because you mentioned we have the spectral child, Santi, who is fascinatingly rendered in that he appears to have a kind of physical form, but he's sort of translucent, and we can see his skeleton as well as we see him almost like he's in a bubble, I suppose, with underwater. But he's a very potent, powerful image. So I'm wondering, what are some other aspects of it you think play that into that?
Well, I mean, obviously the bomb in the middle of this, the orphanage is very much a typical kind of country Spanish house where it's got like I think, like almost like a courtyard, I guess, in the middle of it. So it's very closed off from the outside world, if that's what they choose to be. It's not just a door, it's almost like a gate into this courtyard, and then we have the doors. But yet the bomb represents a haunting of the outside world that has come into them. And it hasn't been, this shell hasn't been detonated. So really they're being haunted by the outside world because it could go off anytime. They don't know if it's, a dead bomb or not. And I think just that constant reminder of, a war that's happened previously with like First World War, and then with the Spanish Civil War and the kind of, the Francoists versus the people who are against Franco. It's just this constant reminder of haunting of ghosts, both past and present.
Yeah, and there's also, I think, important to note.
It's present through other characters as well. It's not just Santi. There's also is it Jacinto?
Yeah,
The-
Jacinto. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a character who's got a lot of baggage because it's implied heavily that he was an ex orphan.
Well, it's not implied. He says it.
but-
He says it outright that he was.
Well, yeah. But we don't say it is what I mean. So it's implied. Yeah, I'll jump off that because I'll dig myself into a hole. But his character has an awful lot of background there because he's described as the prince. What was it? The prince
Without a kingdom,
no castle.
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Prince of
So there's
Kingdom.
an implication there that his past is a complicated one, and again, he is a ghost of his own story, really. So it carries throughout everybody, essentially.
And one thing that comes with Jacinto, you realise that, yeah, he lived there for 15 years at the orphanage, and he feels ashamed of that and having such an unhappy childhood. But you also realise that his headmistress had been taking advantage of him for sexual reasons since he was 17. And he does not have a way to properly grapple with that sexual trauma. And all that leaves him with is to carve a destructive path because he wants to break this painful reminder of his past and take what he believes is owed. But the way he goes about it means that he leaves the current children at the orphanage to have a horrifying time as a result. And as long as he gets what he's owed, he doesn't really care how it impacts the others.
Yeah, I mean, looking at him as a ghost is a weird thing, I feel, because the real ghost, is it the boy who whispers or the one who whispers?
The one who sighs.
That's it, the one who sighs. He's...
Santi.
When you think of Ghost, he's not really it. He's very benign. It's just this kid sort of wandering around. He's presented in a very interesting way as how he died, really. There's like a mist cloud of red coming out of his forehead. When you think of ghosts in horror movies, this isn't a horror movie, but let's just assume it is, because I guess everything is if you look at it in the right way. The real ghost is Jacinto. He behaves like a ghost would in a haunted house movie. He just wreaks havoc on everybody in this lovely little villa. That's the way I saw it, anyway.
It's interesting you describe it as a lovely little villa because, I mean, it is also, the orphanage is also a place of sorrow. I mean, we're talking here about orphans, kids who've lost...
geographically, it's geographically splendiferous, you know.
It's kind of a barren wasteland they're surrounded by. And
when it's a bit more lush, a bit more greenery. Lovely.
Well, I don't want to go on holiday there.
No.
But I think it is important to note that it is a place of sorrow, not least because it's very much about people. I think this goes back to the idea about describing Jacinto as being like a ghost. He is broken, and I think everyone in the film is quite broken. Obviously, you've got the orphans literally the fragments of broken families. As Ygraine pointed out, this is haunted Spain. This is a shattered country at this stage. And then it's interesting to note, I can't take credit for this. I think it was actually an interview Del Toro gave about it. But the three sort of principal adult characters are all missing something. We've got Dr. Cesares, who is the sort of the headmaster of the overseer of the orphanage, and he is impotent. And then there's Carmen, the sort of the matron, the headmistress, and she is missing a leg. And then you've got Jacinto, who is missing a heart. We have all these different broken people, and here they are together. It's kind of something of a kind of a supernatural tragedy. And even though whether we think Santi is the ghost or Jacinto is the ghost, or maybe he's the monster, but at the same time, everyone there is in a way haunting this place. It is they are haunted and they are haunting, And the fact that, and I love the description of this being like a castle, because, hey, it's a castle that's even got buried treasure. As was pointed out, Chiquinto's desperate to find some gold that's in there.
Yeah.
And, hey, there's even a princess in the form of Conchita.
Well, to a degree, yes. I mean, as sad as this movie is, it's also quite charming, I feel. I believe it really does capture the spirit of what it's like to have a bunch of young boys messing around and goading each other, which kind of prevents it from feeling a little too maudlin. Would you say that was fair, Ygraine?
Yeah, I mean, in a country that's divided, it's nice to see that even though, the main character, Carlos, he comes in and at first he's bullied by, a few of the boys, Jaime and I think, who's the other one? Is it called Glow or something? He's bullied. But then eventually they all come together because they realize they have this common thing of just, kind of wanting to survive. And it's just this really nice kind of contrast against what's going on. And it feels very, they bond and build their own family towards the end of it. And it's just really charming. And it's, in an absolute contrast to what is going on around them. But yet, they can kind of come together. And I think it's a really endearing side of the film, in a film that's quite horrible at times, that we do have this kind of coming together.
Yeah. Coming together to do something which, put down something which is quite a common theme in a lot of Guillermo's movies. He does, how can I word this? He does good bastards. Like an evil, hateful character that you want to see hurt, and
Oh, I thought you meant like children whose parents are not. I was like, Jesus, Rob.
No, not doing that. Not doing that term.
I mean, okay, but
I mean, technically he is, but at the same time, no, not that terminology. Like so many of his movies where he's got real evil shit at the centre of it, and it all builds to putting him down, really, and it's quite a fist-pumping ending, I think, for a weirdly solemn movie, which is charming and endearing and sad and historic. Would you say that's fair, James?
So, I'm in two minds with it, because on the one hand, Jacinto gets what he fucking deserves, and what's more fist-pumping than that?
Say it like it is. Say it like it is, James.
Well, I mean, come on. But
don't mince your words.
I mean, when he's dragged down into the water, it feels like very well deserved. But at the same time, I feel there's a bit of tragedy to what's happened, because all throughout, the kids have been kept in the dark about the dangers lurking outside, about the brutality of humanity that could arrive on their doorstep any day to tragically end their lives because of who their parents were. But as things go on, as it becomes more perilous, the kids are confronted with more harsh realities, and that leads them to shed their innocence as they essentially take part in Jacinto's murder. And then when they exit the orphanage at the end, you have that narration about tragedy condemned to repeat itself time and again. And that leaves me wondering, could they overcome this trauma from what's just happened? And can they diverge from where Jacinto went? And I'm hoping that since they've got each other, they will be able to. But a part of me wonders if maybe it's essentially just a group of Jacintos making their way out into a wider world.
I like to think they've got each other. They've found a family with each other, and it's a hopeful ending. Maybe, I don't know. It's the way I read it anyway.
I hope so. Those boys need that happy ending.
Although it's worth noting, perhaps, that yes, they are moving away from the orphanage, which has been something of almost like a prison for them, I suppose. But they don't have much in the way of food or water, and they are going out into, I'm going to say it again, a pretty desolate surroundings, and they are a couple of days' walk from the nearest town. I think it works both ways. You can see it as a hopeful ending. You can also see it as a bleak ending. I mean, are they going to keep going? Are they going to somehow go north and get into France? Are they going to peg out on the road? Are they going to be picked up by sympathetic people and taken, and adopted by new families? And maybe they'll become, productive members of Franco's Spain. I don't know. And I think that's one of Del Toro's great strengths that we'll discuss with some of his other work. He's a master at ambiguity. We can read that ending in a variety of ways. But I think one aspect of the ending that is very tragic is that it ends with the same voiceover that it begins with about what is a ghost. And it's by Casares. And we know by the end what's happened to him. And he is now the ghost. He will be haunting the orphanage, presumably indefinitely. So it's very, I think the most positive way I could describe it is bittersweet. But at the same time, I think it's also very melancholy.
It's very much a fairy tale ending, though, isn't it? So we say this is like a Gothic fairy tale. And that's exactly what Del Toro does. He does and they lived happily ever after. And when we look at fairy tales, we're like, but do they? Like, if we think about it logically, are these fairy tales ending up okay? Because everyone's got to live with a shitload of trauma. Like, and I feel like he really carries that on in his endings, where it seems to be happy and it seems to be, and the good guys won. But then you're like, oh, hold on a minute. If we think about it a bit more, I'm not quite sure.
Good point.
Yes, it's what the Disney sort of, because people think fairy tale, think of the Disney movies,
Exactly,
but you got the Hans Christian Andersen of this world, and he was, wow, and the Brothers Grimm. These original stories were, well, the Brothers Grimm were very accurately named. Real.
Yes.
Yeah. But any closing thoughts on The Devil's Backbone before we move on to something a bit more contemporary in his filmography?
I think it's interesting to think about the significance of the title, because on the one hand, it seems to have a double meaning. It's referred to within the narrative by a character as a particular kind of deformity. That's the best way of putting it. A medical condition that leads to a very protruding backbone, spine, and then I think it's also referred to at some point as a reference to the mountains in the distance having the shape of a devil's backbone. I think that's an interesting aspect to it, in that we are looking at the title refers to what is both literally internal and external. And I think that, and at the same time, it seems to work as a nice metaphor for here is something that is demonic, but yet by having a backbone, it's also being human. And of course, a recurring feature throughout Del Toro's work is love for the monster or the monstrous. And I think one of the things that makes him a particularly visceral filmmaker, I think, is he's not afraid to put visceral, physical violence and injury on screen. One of the things I think is notable, a recurring feature, is talking about those absolute shits who are his villains. Is they all, quite a few of them have a sense of continuing deterioration. In the case of Jacinto, he's injured in an explosion, and we see his one of his eyes has become kind of bloodshot, and that, I'm not sure if it gets worse, but it certainly remains very apparent throughout the film. And we get a similar injury in Pan's Labyrinth, and of course there's also the character of Strickland, played by Michael Shannon, in The Shape of Water, who part of him is literally rotting as the film progresses. And I think it's notable that there is a very problematic cliche about presenting villains as having some kind of physical feature. It's very, you can throw a dartboard at the James Bond series and you will hit a villain with some kind of physical deformity. But I think Del Toro is using it more interestingly, more subtly. He's showing here is the corruption of the soul manifesting physically. It's not that this is, there's a thing there's something wrong with this person physically, therefore evil. It's a matter of this person is evil and it's coming out.
Anything that Vincent put down there that James or Graham want to pick up?
No, I think that was a really good point, and I think a lot of the time we see a facial deformity that, someone already has. But I think in this, yeah, you're absolutely right that it doesn't feel as offensive because it's what results in their depths into evil. Yeah, that's a really good point, Vincent. Yeah.
I think part of the reason it doesn't feel as egregious as some other films can is that other films would depict someone with a facial scarring or like something like that as a monster, but Del Toro is more sympathetic in his depictions of the ones that humanity lazily considers as monsters, the others, those that are different than us. And often the ones who are villainous are the ones who look like quote unquote everyday people. And I think he does well at showing how the real monster can be lurking in everyday clothing and can look like what some may consider a typical ideal. I Nuanced is the correct term, I think, and Del Toro excels at that.
So, moving forward in his filmography, and I think at time of recording, it's his most recent movie, unless I'm totally ignoring something or forgetting something, but 2022's Pinocchio. Have I forgotten something?
Yeah, Nightmare Alley came out afterwards. Nightmare Alley was... No, sorry, you're absolutely right. No, sorry, you're absolutely right. Yes, Nightmare Alley was 21, Pinocchio was 22. Don't know why I thought it was 23. My bad. So, yes.
It's a staggered release date. We get absolutely awful in the UK and Ireland. We just don't get things. It's like 2 years later, you can have it. That's fine. Doesn't matter.
Not to be confused with the actual real live action Pinocchio that also came out the same year as well.
Yeah,
you don't want to get those two mixed up.
No.
Was that a Zemeckis joint, that one?
That was.
Yes, that was a straight to Disney Plus release, I believe.
Yeah, you want to talk about monsters, yes. Go with that film.
Monsters straight from the Uncanny Valley.
So, James, I know you're a big fan of this one, and it's a tricky one to synopsize because there's a lot of other adaptations. But what is this specific Guillermo Del Toro version of Pinocchio? What's the story of this one?
Well, Guillermo Del Toro teams up with director Mark Gustafsson, the tragically late Mark Gustafsson, I should say, and they adapt Pinocchio from the original 1883 novel by Carlo Collodi. And what they do is they take the simple idea of Geppetto creating a boy out of words, and it hits the usual beats of there's a circus ringleader who wants to use him. There's some kind of aquatic whale that causes trouble, let's say. But what he does is he transports it into World War II Italy during the rise of fascism under Mussolini's reign, and creates a dark fairy tale that through stop motion animation that is really beautiful. I find it's a wonderful work about grief, love, the necessity of being true to yourself as opposed to being a puppet on a strings blindly following orders. And I think it's just something which really captures the beauty and tragedy of human life and mortality.
And I go further, and immortality, because this is one of these movies where it appears that it's a happy ending, but happy in the relative constraints of what's happened in the story. I mean, but no, that immortality is a curse that I don't think Geppetto had in mind, really. Graham, what are your feelings on this version of Pinocchio?
So I rather naively, when it came out on Netflix first time round, got me and my son had our movie night, and my poor son, he was 5 at the time, and I was like, let's watch Pinocchio. And then it got about 10 minutes into it, and I was like, oh, maybe not. Let's stick on Mickey Mouse Playhouse instead. Yeah, I put it on, and I think the first time I saw it, I just was not in the correct frame of mind, and I was just like, oh, here we go again, Del Toro and his fascism. But obviously a few years have gone, and what with the state of the world currently, a lot of things have gotten a lot worse. So it's interesting to go back and re-watch it with what is currently kind of more prominent and in our faces in the world. And it's, yeah, I mean, it's still heavy going, but it's just to take something like Pinocchio and be able to transform it into this kind of tale of like morality and immortality, etc., etc. It's just, I mean, it's just typical Del Toro, but yeah, it definitely struck a chord more this time round watching than it did last time.
Vincent?
Pinocchio is a film about learning what it means to live, which is kind of a pretentious thing, I suppose, to say about a stop motion animated film about a puppet who comes to life. Watching it for the second time the other day, there was a point early on when we see Geppetto, after his son has died, been killed in a bombing, and he, and at this point Geppetto's already quite old, it seems, and then we see him by his son's grave and a tree growing. And I remember thinking, wow, he doesn't seem to be getting any older even while this tree is growing. And then I had to stop myself, think, this film is being narrated by a talking cricket. Shut up. And but that's what I think is so remarkable. It is that you have the whimsy of a cricket who is not only talks but also writes. He's an author, wonderfully voiced by Ewan McGregor. So it's got that whimsy, and then you have this complete innocence in the figure of Pinocchio himself. But then, yeah, I think it's interesting that James mentioned in relation to The Devil's Backbone the idea of evil that could be, lurking. But sometimes it's not lurking. It's so very public, because we have the character of Podesta, who's voiced by Ron Perlman in Pinocchio, who is, he's a member of he's a government official. He's in his, very, prominently fascist uniform. And it's all about, what must everyone do for Italy? What must we do for Mussolini's Italy? And through its treatment of innocence and resistance and its engagement with mortality, and I do think personally that mortality is more important here than immortality, because it is through resistance and the collision between childhood innocence and fascism and then the confrontations with death, that is how the film explores what it means to live. So, bit of a roundabout way of saying this is, maybe it's another dark fairy tale, absolutely. And yes, it was funny the way you said it. You said Ygraine. It's about, yeah, look, here's Del Toro doing his fascism again, absolutely, and doing it, but approaching fascism through the lens of children, because all three of the films we're talking about today are to do with that, about children encountering fascism. But in the case of Pinocchio, because of perhaps the most overt fantasy element, both through the whimsy of a cricket and a puppet that comes to life, but then also the incorporation of these various spirits, it does point to a world beyond our own. So it's got this interestingly historically grounded aspect and also this very fantastical element, which I think which might not work. I think many a filmmaker would struggle to balance those two. But in the case of this, I think that's what Del Toro does manage. Well, I should say Del Toro and Gustafsson, and as well as the other screenwriter, Patrick McHale, and Matthew Robbins managed to balance this so that it can explore all of these ideas, and put it across. Yes, resist authority. So, as Ygraine said, so important right now, and understand what it means to live, which to one extent is we have to die. So I can imagine it was a bit heavy for your son, Ygraine.
I mean, even the first
he didn't
10
sit
minutes,
through it, so it's okay.
The first 10 minutes and that bomb scene at the church, I think that's we'll turn this off now moment. But the fascism thing, I think it's the movie which he addresses it most directly. It's been a thematic subtext of every sort of Gothic fantasy he's done, but in this, he goes as far to actually have the literal war effort and to have Pinocchio as a literal child soldier, which I don't think he's done anything quite as, I won't call it grotesque, but let's just for the sake of argument call it grotesque as that.
I think
in my opinion,
we can describe child soldiers as grotesque. Yes, I have no objection to that.
It's so whimsical, though. It's so whimsical and fancy. So.
It's also really fascinating and kind of makes sense that the fascists see this child essentially that's immortal, and they want to weaponize it just against to perfectly illustrate their disregard for human life by racking up. Essentially, they want to rack up loads of kills under this boy who keeps reviving. It's just a fascinating element, I thought.
It kind of feels as if he's trying to say that, like, this sounds really bad, but there will always be children that they will look to exploit, and once one, obviously it passes away, unfortunately, in war, that there's always going to be more, and I think it's a really dark position to take when we talk about like Pinocchio, but that's kind of what I got from that.
Some other interesting deviations as well. Not all successful. I think the musical slight element doesn't really work. It's not a place I'd expect him to go. But as somebody who hates musicals, I will say that.
Oh, same. I'm with you, babe, on that one.
I think I feel that if one is going, I agree that the musical aspect of Pinocchio doesn't work so well, but the reason I don't think it works is it doesn't lean into it. There's a couple of isolated songs rather than being a musical number every few minutes. And I think if you're going to do a musical, go all out.
Yeah, well, I suppose. But there's other variations as well on the Pinocchio theme. The lying thing, where if you tell a lie, your nose will grow. That is... Well, it's surreal, really, compared to before, where it was just his nose got longer. It's almost like, how can I word this? He's turned into a tree form, isn't he? His nose sort of spirals out and contorts in all of these weird and different angular shapes. And he's...
Okay.
I'm trying to put something down here. I'm figuring the words out, but you know what I mean. He's an inanimate object carved out of wood, and he's turning to his previous form, almost.
I guess maybe because it was the wood sprite who animated him. So, I guess if he was to do anything, it would be kind of tree-like, because she is, a spirit of the forest, basically.
Or because he's lying, he's actually providing fertilizer for the tree to grow because he's spouting bullshit. I know, that's a reach.
What I was going to say is that it's like he's meant, the whole thing the wood sprite wants is for Pinocchio to essentially become a good boy, and the idea of him lying is almost like regressing, like he 2 steps back and perhaps regressing into the tree form via his nose, is like his body is taking 2 steps back as well.
Brilliant. That's it. Thank you, James. You said it. Yes, that makes far more sense than the nonsense I spouted.
Should we talk about the ending?
All right.
It is a very big sort of left turn as far as this Pinocchio archetype, this Pinocchio story goes.
Indeed. in the sense of he stays he stays wooden. He never actually becomes becomes, obviously he's organic. He never becomes human.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing, isn't it? He wishes him to be a human boy. He loses his child, so he wants a real one. This wouldn't want to become a real one, but he doesn't. He outlives everybody, and there's a really emotional scene on this hill at the end, which is he was just Guillermo was being a bit nasty with the ending of this one, I think. That's the way I put it, anyway.
Poor Spazzatura. Poor monkey.
Yes, I've only just realised, looking as like, oh right, it was Kate Blanchett voicing Spazzatura. Like,
Yes.
what an interesting role for her to play.
Yeah, so the reason for that is that after Kate Blanchett worked with Del Toro on Nightmare Alley, she was like, oh, I want to work with Del Toro again. Do you have any roles in Pinocchio? And all there was Spazzatura. And she was like, oh, yes, I'll take that.
Yeah, reminds me of George Clooney playing the dog in the South Park movie. Not quite as weird, but it's up there. Is there anything else that we want to bring up about Pinocchio before we wrap this one up? Ygraine, James?
I kind of like, now I don't know if this is me just being a bit thingy, but I kind of like how there's this continuation of like this fantastical whimsy in Pinocchio that we kind of recognize in Pan's Labyrinth, like the sprites and death, the design of them looks very much like, like the faun in Pan's Labyrinth and that kind of, and I really like that continuation and how they look a bit like as well, like biblical angels as well, like with all the eyes and I loved the design of the kind of the sprite and death as well. I just thought they were incredible.
Well, one thing I like is so at one point Mussolini appears and he's voiced by Tom Kenny, and I just think this should set the groundwork, and more films should have SpongeBob voicing dictators with the vocabulary range of Borat.
Is that who that was?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's an odd bit of trivia. Wrong generation for SpongeBob, I think. Me.
One other thing I think worth mentioning, thinking of what James said about Tom Kenny, because he voices Mussolini quite right, as well as the right-hand man and the sea captain, which reminded me there's a point when the monstrous sea creature is coming to swallow the ship. The sea captain sort of salutes and falls off the ship. And that is one of many moments of film that are, not only is this, touching and inventive and at times quite dark, some of it's also very funny. And it does make me think, I wonder if Del Toro will introduce more humour in some of his future work, because he's got sometimes quite, grim or dark humour, but I'd like to see him do something a bit more out and out funny.
Maybe Frankenstein's going to be a comedic retelling.
Could be.
You never know.
I mean, yeah. Tell it as a dark comedy. That could be interesting.
He can do whatever. I mean, at least it'll be better than the Kenneth Branagh version in the 90s. So,
hey, you take that back. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is gloriously camp.
I wouldn't say that about it, but okay.
The book is very melodramatic as well.
Okay, so I guess that leads us to the final movie of this part of the Guillermo del Toro. Pan's Labyrinth. So, Vincent, Pan's Labyrinth. What is the story to Pan's Labyrinth?
Ooh, the story of Pan's Labyrinth is an adult fairy tale of resistance and fascism. Oh, there's that again. Fantasy and reality, imagination, and what may happen at the corners of our eyes. Set in Spain in 1944, so a few years after the end of the Civil War, we follow Ophelia, a young girl whose widowed mother has remarried to the extremely Francoist loyal Captain Vidal, Vidal commands his new family to come to a remote outpost in, I believe, must be the Pyrenees, not far from the French border, where a group of rebels are continuing to stand up for the Spain that they have already lost. And while there, Ophelia encounters a labyrinth where there is a faun who tells her that if she completes 3 tasks, she can return to the fairy kingdom, for she is in truth a fairy princess. And all manner of weirdness and beauty and horrors ensue.
So, James, what's your feelings on the Labyrinth of the Faun, to give it its Spanish title, which I always thought was weird. It was called Pan's Labyrinth, but okay. What were your feelings on this one?
Well, it's hard to put into words because I genuinely think this is one of the greatest films I have ever seen, personally. And I just think it's such an...
Okay.
Yeah, no pressure or anything, but I just think it's such an exemplary film. I think it wonderfully delivers an unvarnished look at a fairy tale. Del Toro just really delves into that side of things, but also does not hold back with the brutality and the pain of life under fascist rule. I think it's just an exemplary work, which I think is just exemplary. I'll just leave it there.
And Ygraine?
Pan's Labyrinth is one of these films that made me fall in love with cinema. Another one is Lady Vengeance, which we've previously discussed, but this one was another one that was just, you watch it the first time and you can't stop thinking about it afterwards, and it just... Even when I think about it, so often when we look back on like early 2000s films, we're like, oh, that doesn't look too good. That hasn't aged well. Whereas like going back and watching it again today, I watched it today or yesterday, I can't remember. And I mean, there are a few effects where we're like, it's kind of dodgy. However, the feeling and the atmosphere and the gut-wrenching like narration, how no one is safe in this film, it's just perfect. It's such a perfect film, and I completely agree with James when he says that it is one of the greatest films ever, because I absolutely believe that. And it's one of these films that I cannot wait till my son's a bit older to show him. Whether he gets into film or not, he's going to see this film. I'm going to make him sit down and watch this film. I just think it's absolutely perfect,
It's a weird one for me because this was a comfort movie when I was younger. I'm watching it back and like, what was wrong with me?
We all have them. The Exorcist is my comfort movie, so
But that's we all have them. It's structurally quite weird, really, isn't it? Because effectively, what it is besides the settings and the paraphernalia around the edges, it is basically a preteen girl going out into the countryside around their house, imagining adventures. Whether they're real, whether they're imaginary, doesn't matter. But that is structurally what it is. It's just playtime. A girl having playtime in the woods near her house. Which I think makes it very relatable. Because, again, it was one of those movies that I first saw and I thought movies could be like this. Because you just watch movies before that, and then you watch that, and it's like, okay, there's options here for what movies and what stories it can tell, which was a nice moment. I think three of us collectively share. The creature effects, I think that's the big thing that we need to talk about first. That put Guillermo on the map, really, didn't it? It's like pick your poison, really, as to who is your favourite creation, because there's just so many in this.
Well, if we list through who the sort of significant creatures are, we've got the fairies. We have a stick insect that turns into a fairy. We have the faun himself. We have the toad. There's the pale man. And am I missing anything? Those are the 4 big ones.
The mandrake. There's
yes.
the little mandrake as well.
The mandrake root. And it's worth noting, of course, that they are all quite distinctive. I mean, note, of course, that both the faun and the pale man are played by the same fantastic performer, Doug Jones. But despite that, you wouldn't know that they were played by the same performer. The way they move is so completely distinctive. And then the mandrake and the fairy and the toad also are also very distinct. And yeah, as you say, Del Toro's creature designs are something he's absolutely famous for. Whenever there are interviews with him, he will sometimes pull out his sketchbook and show the various creature designs that he comes up with. And let's not discount the work of the effects team, because I'm sure it takes a huge team to put together those various effects, some practical, some digital. But I love that those different creatures all serve very distinct narrative purposes. They work so well. The way they look is so distinctive, and the way they behave is so distinctive, and what they mean to Ophelia on her journey is unique in each case. So yeah, I mean, if I was, I don't know if we're going to pick favourites here.
Pale man, but no, I don't think we will.
All right, fair enough. Yeah, probably the pale man for me as well.
Yeah, I think for mine it's the pale man, and I think the design is so freaky. Like the fact that he's got like his little eyes in his hands, and I mean, even people that haven't perhaps seen Pan's Labyrinth kind of know about the pale man, and you just put your hands in front of your eyes before obviously Longlegs came out, but everyone was like, oh, it's the pale man. And I also love what that scene signifies, the fact that she can't take from his table, otherwise that's when he'll see her. And it's just this kind of representation of Captain Vidal and Francois, that they don't think about, they don't see the other people until they feel like they've taken from their table, and that's when they've got to get their revenge and wreak havoc. And I just love that whole scene. I think he's absolutely fantastic, and so sad, the poor little fairies.
And I think to add to it as well is that Ophelia doesn't even take that much from the table, especially in regards to how much there is. The pale man is essentially like, with how much edible wealth he has, he's like a dragon sitting on a mountain of gold. Never going to have it all, but there's the slightest bit gets taken by someone who is more deserving, more needing of it. Then he gets up, then he pursues us mercilessly, then he's intent on punishing her no matter what. And yeah, it's just greed in form in a fantasy skin.
To ration out to people, and he's like, you're not allowed, only one ration book per family. And I just love that it's mirrored, and that, Rob, you talked about, whether it was real or not in Ophelia's mind. And a lot of the time when children are experiencing trauma, or they're experiencing kind of, the badness of the world, they kind of liken it back to monsters or to fairy tales, and they kind of create these things in their head about, just to try to come to terms with what is actually going on in their world. And that's how I feel Ophelia is dealing with this, by creating these monsters, by creating these fairy tales, and almost like a disassociative kind of daydreaming, just to try and come to terms with what her and her whole country kind of are being put through.
It's the most ambiguous movie I think he's ever made with that particular thing in mind. Because Devil's Backbone, it's pretty cut and dry until it gets the ending. But this, it could just all be, nothing could really be happening at all. And it's interesting for that, I think. It creates quite a challenging movie, because when I was younger and I watched it, I just took it as read that it was all happening. But a bit older, it's, much more interesting that way.
I find that film that it gets better the more times I see it, because as I say, I saw this in when it was out in cinemas. God, that's almost 20 years ago now, and a few times since then as well. And each time I watch it, I find more. And that thing you mentioned, Rob, the ambiguity, I think gets more pronounced, because the first time I saw it, I think I felt it was, well, there's this storyline and there's this storyline, and I'm not sure that they're really interwoven neatly enough. What did I know? Watching it again, the interweaving of the different narrative threads, what's going on directly with Ophelia and what's going on not directly with her. And I guess we should talk about Captain Vidal in a bit more detail. But I think it is, absolutely agree, it is Del Toro's most ambiguous work. And it is exquisitely ambiguous, particularly through its rhyming beginning and end, that the very opening shot is of Ophelia lying on the ground with blood going back up into her nose. And then we flash back, and then that's how it ends, with her dying. And I hope this comes with a spoiler warning. But that ending, it's a matter of, okay, so maybe she actually died and it was all in her head, or maybe it was all true and she made the sacrifice and she has passed back to the fairy kingdom. And I think we could come down, like, one could argue the point to come down on one side or the other, but I think what makes the film sing so loud, so beautifully, is that we don't know. It could go either way, and I think that makes it more hopeful than The Devil's Backbone, certainly, which I actually, as I said, I think that's quite a grim ending. But Pan's Labyrinth, because of its ambiguity, and I suppose the point being, it doesn't necessarily matter if it was real or not, because if in those final moments of her death, Ophelia believed it. I think it's that moment where she's smiling at the very end, because she's, one way or another, it's kind of the power of belief. And yeah, that's part of what the film is about, I suppose, the power of belief. And we see that both in terms of what she believes in her fantasy, and then the dream of freedom and a better Spain that the rebels, most prominently, I suppose, Mercedes, believe. So yeah, this is a film about belief. And part of that is, of course, you don't really know.
That is true. Going back to what I said earlier about him doing good absolute shits, I think Captain Vidal is the greatest achievement of his career in that regard, because I don't recall seeing a more evil character in many times, really.
One of the great cinematic monsters.
He is, yeah. So what are our feelings on him, Ygraine?
He's just, I love the way, again, looking at this like fairy tale, that we've subverted the very typical fairy tale trope of an evil stepmother, and we now have an evil stepfather. And, it's the mother that has had to remarry, and, it's just, I just think it's this great subversion of a trope, and he is evil. Like I said, he is the pale man kind of personified, and he is so, not only is he horrible to the people, but he's horrible to Ophelia. He has no care for her. All he cares about is this son. Yeah, and he's just really horrible. She's like, a poor little kind of Cinderella, the one that has to nurse her mother and look after her mother, and yeah, almost become invisible to him, for him to kind of deal with her. And he's just, the fact that, just pure evil, that he can get shot and his face slit open and he just kind of carries on, and it's just, I don't know, something just really horrible about him, and he just gives me the ick and the creeps and the chills and everything, which means, like, what an amazing villain that Del Toro has created, really.
Oh yeah, brilliantly performed as well, because well, there wasn't any contemporaries at that time, really, so it was a very brave performance in a very brave movie. But James, your feelings on Captain Vidal?
Well,
Well,
I think Captain Vidal is indeed one of the great cinematic motherfuckers out there.
Quite literally.
Yeah, it's true. I find it really interesting how he's so sure of himself. His only focus is having a son and enacting his will. And part of that will is the brutal violence, which is done with such a chilling casualness to it. Like when he's with the rebel who's stuttering, and he's just there like, go on, I'll let you go if you just count to 3 without stuttering. And just the whole time, he's so sure of himself. He's like, yeah, I'll say this. You won't reach number 3 without doing it, though. And also an earlier scene when he's got the father and son who claimed they're out hunting rabbits. And the way he deals with them two, it's like he doesn't even break a sweat or blink an eyelid regarding the horrific brutality that he inflicts. But then at the end of it, when he realizes, oh, they were telling the truth, they weren't actually working against me, all he can say is, make sure you check them properly next time. And he's an absolute monster, and he is so compelling to watch. I think he's just a really masterfully played character that you love to boo and hiss at.
Well, I think it's worth noting that much like Podesta in Pinocchio, the character of Vidal, he is, of course, also very much a figure of the state, as he's in his, he is in his uniform. He's very, he has this pocket watch that he's always cleaning very carefully. After he gets stabbed and his face slit open, he literally stitches himself back together. And it goes back to this idea of his monstrousness is now being manifested in the corruption of his body. It was weird, this came out 2 years before The Dark Knight, and we see what is only referenced in that, about, having the knife blade in one's mouth, and smile. But of course he is also he's a fanatic. He is a true believer in Franco's Spain. So the fact that he is so oppressive to everyone around him, Ophelia, not to mention Carmen, his wife, and all the staff of the house and the men under him, and of course the rebels that he executes without breaking a sweat, as James said. He is a manifestation of fascism, and in that respect, I think that's, of course, part of what makes him so utterly chilling and terrifying, because that makes him believable. And of course, on top of all of that, we've mentioned many of the horrible things he does. And then, of course, what's his last act? He shoots a child. He just shoots Ophelia in the gut.
Not just a child.
Yes.
His own child.
He shoots a kid, just completely without batting an eyelid, just in case we had any doubts about him. No. This man is irredeemable. And I love that his final moment, he gets so put in his place when Mercedes tells him, your son won't even know your name. And I think it's notable that she shoots him in the face, the other side. Earlier, she cut open his mouth on the left, and then she shoots him in the right cheek. And good on her. Totally ruining this dreadful man.
Yes. What's interesting about this is kind of it's become a film bro movie. I think because it's good, but I think what's more interesting about that sort of status is this is a world cinema title. This is a movie in Spanish, but the success of it was so profound that it basically made Guillermo Del Toro, as far as filmmakers go, a household name overnight. And in the past 10, 15 years, outside of Oldboy with Park Chan-wook and I guess that's not many
until
more,
Parasite.
really. It's rarefied air that it exists in. Well, I was trying to think of Bong Joon-ho, what really got him on the map, but it probably was that, wasn't it? Despite loving him before that. I was not one of these Johnny Come Lately.
Parasite was a mainstream success.
It's a rare thing for world cinema to be so hugely successful. So what is it you think that really cut through for people in that sort of way? That's an open-ended question. Anybody can take that one.
not to
have
just
something.
be basic about it, but it probably was that it won an Oscar, and that probably gave it a sense of
Hang on, wait, James. Which
that it was
Oscars are you referring to? Because remember, it didn't win International Feature.
what, Pan's Labyrinth?
No, it did not.
Oh, which one did it
lost
win?
to The Lives of Others. That one International Feature. No, Pan's Labyrinth was. But the fact that you thought it did, maybe that's as important as much as anything else. That it was that. Oh yeah, that was the Oscar winner. Well, actually, it wasn't. But it's interesting that it almost seemed that it almost was, and probably some might say that it should have been. That silly thing to say about any awards, really. But I think that might have contributed to its popular, to its sort of cultural imprint. I am now trying to look up what it actually did win. It definitely won cinematography.
It won Best Art Direction, Best Cinematography, Best Makeup. It did win a BAFTA for Best Film, not in English language. Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, never mind the point I was going to make then. I'm wrong.
I think maybe it became quite popular because I think it married the fantastical and the kind of real world horror really well. And not to say that, the absolute horror and trauma that is portrayed in Pan's Labyrinth is softened, but I think more people could kind of consume it and digest it because of the fairy tale visuals and elements to it. And I think a lot of people are kind of drawn to that more than they would be like a really hard, depiction of Spain in 1944. And I think that's what did it for a lot of people.
I think you're right, Ygraine. It's the fact that it managed to do this fairy tale that was also kind of a war film, and it had this strong fantasy element. And of course, it does present the extremely relatable position of being a child. I mean, that's one thing that, regardless of your nationality, everyone has been a kid. Now, not that necessarily translates into every movie about kids that's not in the English language being a big success. I mean, how many people saw Tigers Are Not Afraid, for instance? However, not enough, precisely right. But yeah, so I think you're right. It's a combination. There was no one reason, but there was enough of a combination of reasons, because Del Toro, the only sort of recognizable name associated with it, Ivana Banquero, Sergi Lopez, Maribel Verdu, were these people known outside of Spain? I somehow doubt it.
Well, the Ophelia, the young woman who plays the Ophelia, she's having an acting career over in America now, and it's really weird to see her, because you still imagine her as like a 8-year-old girl or something. No, not ages ago.
My first time at Fright Fest, I saw her in something in which she played an English character, and she sounded perfectly English. And I thought, hang on, I recognise that name. And Claire and I said, well, shit, good grief, it's Ophelia. That's just mad. So, yeah, it was kind of impressive. Feedback, that was the film I saw her in back in 2019. Very, very surprising. But, of course, that's post Pan's Labyrinth for her.
Any closing thoughts on Pan's Labyrinth before we talk about the director himself, James Ygraine, Vincent?
Well, I am really interested in how the story sees the adults are experiencing so much terror, whether they're like perpetuating it, receiving it, or they're living in fear of it. It feels like they're all constantly struggling to believe in something better than hopelessness. And when you see many people see Ophelia, she's losing herself in these fairy tales which really captivate her, and they chastise her as like, oh, how can you read those things? As though her escaping that bleak reality in favor of something that makes sense to her is alien to them, because it's almost as though these adults are going, I have to wallow in this miserable life, or you should be here with me. But yes, it all seems so bleak, but I think the film really captures the importance of finding those little moments of hope which carry us forward. There's a point where the revolutionaries are uncertain about if they can triumph against Vidal and his fascist troop, but they're more than willing to try. And it's through Mercedes, the most compassionate member, who is there for Ophelia all throughout, who essentially delivers the biggest blows to Captain Vidal. There's the knife to his face, and then there's the gunshot to the other side of his face. And both those times, the captain is kind of losing himself in a fantasy as well. He's starting this monologue both times about what he wants. It's kind of a grandstanding to kind of paint himself as somebody greater than this awful little fascist that he is. And I just love how Mercedes, every time, she breaks that reality to kind of slap him back to earth. And it just feels like the best middle finger to him and the best middle finger to the fascist scum who constantly seem to pop up every now and then.
Yes.
And in all sorts of, in various countries.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Any closing thoughts on Pan's Labyrinth, Ygraine?
I was just, we see in a lot of Ophelia's daydreams how these creatures kind of represent a lot of the people around her, whether it is, the fairies kind of representing Mercedes and the people on the outskirts that are trying to, break down this fascism. Vidal as the Pale Man. I'm kind of wondering and kind of picking up on whether her visualization of the faun is in fact herself and her morality, and her trying to, kind of almost set challenges for herself to try and live through what she is living through, and especially at the end, where she does have this choice to make about whether she's going to leave her brother behind or whether she's going to try take him with her, and it just feels very much like the faun is like the manifestation of her morality and of her choices that she feels that she has to make.
I love that. When you started saying that the faun could be this manifestation, I was, being such a product of patriarchy, thought you were going to say manifestation of her father, who is, of course, completely absent. But yeah, the idea of it being a manifestation of her and her own sense of morality, that is a fantastic reading. I love it. Thank you for bringing that one up. Yeah, one thing I think is interesting, just talking about the familial aspects of it, something that struck me in the visuals, and this might echo maybe in the art, we talked about the eyes of Pinocchio. I was struck by, there's a recurring visual motif of female reproductive imagery, the kind of image of the curving fallopian tubes there in the horns of the faun, which appears also over the entrance into the labyrinth. And it's there when Ophelia opens the book that the faun gives her, the way the image is spread over the page. And I think that's an interesting kind of valorization of the feminine, because I'm not going to go so far as to say that this is a feminist film, but I think it does have some interesting critiques of patriarchy and championing of the female, both through the figures of Ophelia and Mercedes, of course, and then through the condemnation figure of Vidal. And I think the fact that we have, in a way, Ophelia is returning, almost like returning to something of a womb, and of course the emergence of her brother from her mother's womb is what kills Carmen. I think that it's got an interesting engagement with and treatment of reproduction as well.
Okay, very good. So we'll finish on two questions. The easier one we'll go with first. So, is basically what would you recommend from his filmography? We obviously can't do everything. There's another episode where we're talking about his more blockbuster excesses. So, another film from his filmography from the three of you. Which one really stands out for you? Not necessarily just one. It might be a few. So, James, we'll go with yourself first.
Well, one of my favourites, I'd say, is Hellboy 2: The Golden Army, especially when you've got the monster market within there. And I feel it's just the best kind of adaptation of a comic book film, really, where it gives us the big bombastic, impressive battle stuff. I mean, there's a great moment involving a beanstalk on the rampage, but on top of that, I think it just does well with relationships and making the characters so memorable, and simple moments resonate in the mind. I mean, there's one where Hellboy and Abe just sing "Can't Smile Without You," and it's just such a lovely little moment. I think it's great.
Ends on another gut punch as well.
Yeah, kind of wish we got the third film.
Yeah, there's more. You had more in common with the thing you just killed than the people you work for, which is not a nice note, but it's a intelligent note for what is basically a superhero movie to end on. Yeah.
True.
Ygraine, yourself.
Ugh, this is too hard, because if someone was like, recommend something to me, I'd be like, just do it all. Just have a Del Toro season, a Del Toro month, please. Particular ones that come to mind, if I had to, it would be Crimson Peak, because again, it's just visually stunning, Gothic beauty. Like, love it, absolute love it. The Shape of Water. We talk about love for monsters, and I feel like that film is just an embodiment of everyone who loves monsters, literally. Does it go into weird areas? Maybe. But sure, look, listen, who hasn't had a fantasy about a water monster? And also, I just want to point out the anthology horror series he did, Guillermo Del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities. Although it's a collection of horror stories directed by other people, I just feel like it just, all of those individual stories embody Del Toro, because it's just all these directors being like, well, you know, I've got to come together for this guy and do my best. And I just feel like they've all come at their best for this collection. I just think it's great. It's absolutely amazing.
I will stand by you for Crimson Peak. It feels like that one gets hated on an awful lot. It's just that old-fashioned Gothic romance, and it's beautiful, honestly, but
I feel like it's going to have a revival. People are going to go back on it and realise that it's great.
I hope so. I really do. And Vincent, yourself?
Well, if they hadn't already been mentioned, I would have also be championing certainly The Shape of Water and Crimson Peak. However, as they've already been mentioned, I will fly the flag for, I mentioned it earlier, and I will again, Nightmare Alley. I think it's probably another Del Toro that kind of gets a bit forgotten, maybe because it's a remake, maybe because it's less fantastical than his other work, and partly because it is very much kind of something of an homage to an earlier stretch of filmmaking. But I think it is still very much steeped in what Del Toro does. Nightmare Alley, I think, is a sumptuous, effusive, and superb modern noir. It takes what we understand as film noir and gives it the contemporary aspects. It's got ravishing detail, it's immersive style, and it's gorgeous in its treatment of deceit, deception, and dark desire. And I will also fly the flag for, I guess, what is probably his most bombastic film, Pacific Rim, which is a kind of movie that it was great to see that on the biggest screen you can. I'm like, damn, that was big. So yeah, but frankly, I don't think there's a dud in his whole filmography.
No, I don't think so. Underwhelming, sure, but not a dud. That's not the same thing. So if, again, I ask this of every director that we do on this show, but heaven forbid he retired tomorrow. He's not going to. He's great. He's got more ideas than he knows what to do with. But if he did, what is his legacy as a filmmaker? James, put you on the spot first of that difficult question.
Right. Okay. I feel his legacy as a filmmaker is, well, firstly, casting an unflinching light on fascism and the ways it perpetuates, the ways it seeps into culture, and how the effect it can have on people who have to live under its horrific rule. I feel he'll also have an understanding, and love for those who are, as I said before, considered the other, the quote unquote monsters of society. I feel he's going to have a legacy as an empathic creator, and that's not even getting into how dazzling his creations can be. I mean, Pacific Rim, with the giant robots. We've got the creations of Pan's Labyrinth, and of course the merman at the center of The Shape of Water. Actually, you know what? If anything, I think his legacy is going to be having a fish fucking movie win Best Picture.
Yes. Subtle, very subtle. I like it.
No argument there.
Is there anything to add to that, Ygraine and Vincent? Because I think he's nailed it pretty well there.
How can you follow fish fucking up with anything? I mean, I think for me, he's created such worlds that almost, and I know this is such a strange metaphor, but almost feel like you are diving into the most luxurious chocolate box ever, full of jewel tones and flavors, and just, it feels, his films visually feel luxurious. And I can't think of any other director that has been able to do something like that. And also, he just feels like one of us. He feels like, you know, the biggest fan of monsters and creatures and horror, and yeah, that just makes me like endear him to me even more, the fact that he's like one of us. And I feel like that's his legacy, a horror fan's horror fan. If that makes sense.
Yeah. And Vincent, yourself.
Well, you gave me the most time, so I've had it too easy. I think Del Toro's legacy is the presentation and expression of the fantastical in a way that is grounded, tactile, and always believable.
Concise and to the point. I like it. Yeah.
Occasionally I manage that.
So that'll be it for this week. Whether this is part 1 or part 2, that's future Rob's problem. But essentially, the next episode proper will be the year of 2024 in review, in which this podcast teams up with Popscreen to run down a few of our favourites. We do it in a different way. We do it month by month, and we just talk about what came out each month in a never-ending attempt to make it a manageable length to listen to, and not about a week long, which is always the challenge with these things. So with that in mind, and that coming next, where can we find you guys online? So James, yourself, where can we find you and the stuff you do?
Well, if you want to find me on social media, I'm on Blue Sky, Threads, Letterboxd at RoddersJ04, spelt with 2 Ds. My writings can be found at thereviewingrodders.co.uk. I also regularly contribute at nerdly.co.uk. So if you're not sick of me, or if I don't talk about fish fucking as much, I promise.
Very disappointing.
But yeah,
you're making it difficult for me tonight. You can find me
Follow
on
that, I guess.
Instagram at What a Scream and Blue Sky What a Scream as well. I write and review and I'm editor of whatascreampodcast.com, where you can find reviews and editorials, etc. And you can also find my podcast, Gore Things, where myself and my co-host Brad Hanson talk about some of the nastiest films ever committed to celluloid. And you can find us at Gore Things Pod on most social media.
Excellent. Check those out. And Vincent, yourself, to take us out for the week.
Well, you can find out about my fish fucking by drawing a door with chalk. And that will take you to my social media, which is at Dr. Gain. That's DRGAINE. That is me on Instagram, X for now, Letterboxd, Blue Sky and Threads. Please check out mine and James's podcast, Invasion of the Poddy People, which you can find on the Not Just for Kids movie club, where myself and James, along with Russell, talk movie news, reviews and deep dives on the recommendations. You can see plenty of my reviews on The Geek Show, as well as the Critical Movie Critics. And if you visit my blog, Vincent's Views, I link there to my various podcast appearances.
You can find me across all social media at Uncut Robcast. And if you want to get in touch with the show to say anything, even if it's just a hurl of abuse, I'll take any emails at this point. It's directorsuncutpod@gmail.com. But yeah, until next time, thank you very, very much for listening.